March 22nd, 2026, 5:47 local time. Osan Air Base, Republic of Korea, approximately 48 kilometers south of Seoul and 180 kilometers south of the Korean demilitarized zone. The pre-dawn sky is clear and bitterly cold, -4 degrees Celsius. Wind 11 knots from the northwest. Visibility unlimited under a half moon that illuminates the base's flight line in pale silver light. The air is so dry that the sound of engines carries across the entire base without distortion. On Osan's primary runway and on the 2 parallel taxiways flanking it, the morning's first alert cycle is already underway. 6 F-35A Lightning. 2 fifth-generation multi-role fighters belonging to the 36th Fighter Squadron are staged in 2 3-ship elements on the main ramp. 3 aircraft are at Alert 5 status. Crews strapped in, engines on external power, weapons loaded, ready for engine start and takeoff within 5 minutes of a scramble order. 3 more are at Alert 15, crews in the squadron building 200 meters from the flight line. The aircraft's AN/APG-81 active electronically scanned array radars are in standby. Their internal weapon bays carry AIM-120D AMR AAM rounds and 2 GBU-31J DAM precision-guided bombs. The base's Patriot PAC-3 battery, Alpha Battery, 1st Battalion, 43rd Air Defense Artillery Brigade, is deployed at its standard position on the base's northwestern perimeter. Its AN/MPQ-65 fire control radar in active search. 2 launcher groups with a total of 32 PAC-3 MSE interceptor rounds in ready configuration. The battery has been on DEFCON 3 posture since the previous evening, when U.S. Strategic Command issued an elevated warning notification following a 14-hour period of abnormally high activity at 3 DPRK missile garrison facilities observed by overhead surveillance. The duty officer in the 51st Fighter Wings Command Post received the DEFCON 3 notification at 21:30 the previous evening. He logged it, notified the wing commander, and ensured the alert cycle was appropriately manned. He had received 340 DEFCON notifications in his career. None had been followed by a launch. The 341st is now 11 minutes away. Welcome. I'm your host at Navy Legends, and tonight we are examining the threat that every U.S. Air Force planner in the Pacific has been wargaming against for 2 decades without ever fully solving. The concentrated ballistic missile strike against a forward-deployed airbase, specifically against the aircraft on its ramp and the runway surface they depend on to take off and land. Tonight, we are not examining a naval engagement. We are examining the land-based dimension of the same asymmetric calculus. The recognition by DPRK planners that the most effective way to neutralize the U.S. Air Force's F-35 fleet in Korea is not to shoot them down in air-to-air combat, where the F-35's capabilities are overwhelming, but to destroy them on the ground before they can become airborne. A Hwasong 11 variant carrying a DPICM cluster munition warhead over Osan at first light is not a missile defense problem. It is a runway survival problem, an aircraft survivability problem, and a base recovery problem that the U.S. military has been systemically underinvesting in for 30 years. Tonight, we examine what that gap costs. This is a fictional simulation. Every system named is real. Let's begin. The weapon was a Hwasong 11D, a solid-fuel short-range ballistic missile assessed as a direct derivative of the Russian 9M7-23 Iskander-M, with a range of approximately 700 kilometers, a depressed trajectory option that reduces radar detection time, and a terminal phase maneuver capability that had rendered it resistant to first-generation PAC-2 engagements. The Hwasong 11D had first appeared in North Korean military parades in 2019. Its warhead options had been assessed by DIA as including conventional high-explosive unitary, thermobaric, and, the option employed this morning, dual-purpose improved conventional munition, DPICM, a cluster warhead that dispenses hundreds of submunitions over a wide area during terminal descent. The DPICM warhead variant carried approximately 340 M42 submunition equivalents, each a combined anti-armor and anti-personnel grenade-sized projectile dispensed from the carrier body at an altitude of 800 to 1,200 meters, creating a lethal area coverage pattern of approximately 200 meters by 400 meters per warhead detonation. Against parked aircraft on an open ramp, the submunition pattern does not need to achieve a direct hit on an airframe. Penetration of a fuel tank, control surface damage, engine ingestion of submunition fragments, or damage to avionics bay access panels is sufficient to ground an aircraft for hours or days of damage assessment and repair. 4. Hwasong 11. D missiles had been assigned to the Osan strike. The targeting solution allocated 2 missiles to the primary ramp area where the F-35 alert aircraft were staged, 1 missile to the fuel storage and aircraft maintenance area on the base's eastern side, and 1 missile to the runway surface itself, with the specific aim point at the runway's primary threshold, the section that every aircraft must cross for takeoff. The 4 missiles launched from 2 road-mobile TEL vehicles positioned in a valley complex 22 kilometers northeast of Kaesong at 5:36, 11 minutes before our timestamp. The launches were detected by the SBIR satellite at 5:36:08. The warning reached USFK Command at 5:36:41, reached NORAD at 5:36:44, and reached the Patriot Battery at Osan at 5:36:51. 43 seconds after launch, the AN/M PQ-65 fire control radar had already acquired 2 of the 4 tracks on its own at 5:36:55. The missiles had cleared their boost phase and were in the coast-to-target phase of their trajectory. The other 2 tracks were acquired at 5:37:04 as their trajectories carried them above the radar horizon at Osan's position. The battery commander had 4 confirmed inbound tracks and 32 PAC-3 MSE interceptors. Standard 2-round salvo doctrine, 8 interceptors against 4 tracks, leaving 24 in reserve. He authorized engagement at 5:37:11, and the first PAC-3 MSE rounds left their launchers at 5:37:19. In the command post, the duty officer had received the SBIR's alert at 5:36:51 and immediately ordered the base-wide alarm. The alarm began sounding at 5:37:03. In the squadron building, the Alert 15 crews were running for their aircraft at 5:37:05. On the ramp, the Alert 5 pilots received the alarm on their headsets at 5:37:04. They were already strapped in. The flight lead initiated engine start at 5:37:06. Engine light off on an F-35A takes approximately 90 seconds from start initiation to minimum power for taxiing. The aircraft would not be airborne before the missiles arrived. The Hwasong 11D flight time from launch to target at 180 kilometers range on a depressed trajectory was approximately 4 minutes and 40 seconds. The missiles had launched at 5:36. They would reach Osan at approximately 5:40:40. The PAC-3 MSE engagement sequence was executing against all 4 tracks simultaneously. The first 2 engagements, against the 2 missiles targeted on the main ramp, achieved direct hits at 5:39:14 and 5:39:19. Both missiles were intercepted at altitude above 20 kilometers. Both DPICM warhead bodies disintegrated under the PAC-3 kinetic energy impact. No submunitions reached the base. The third engagement, against the missile targeted at the fuel and maintenance area, achieved a direct hit at 5:39:28 at 18 kilometers altitude. The warhead body was structurally compromised but not fully disintegrated. The damaged warhead body and its carrier vehicle debris tumbled from their intercept point on a ballistic arc that carried them to impact 3.4 kilometers northeast of the base perimeter in an agricultural field. No submunitions dispensed. Third missile, neutralized. The fourth engagement encountered the Hwasong 11D's terminal maneuver capability at 5:39:41, 59 seconds before projected impact. The fourth missile executed a lateral jink of 340 meters to the east, followed by a nose-down pitch correction that steepened its dive angle from 68 degrees to 79 degrees. The maneuver was executed at 18 kilometers altitude after the first PAC-3 round assigned to it had already committed to an intercept trajectory based on the pre-maneuver flight path. The first PAC-3 missed by 22 meters, close enough that the proximity fuse should have detonated. but the PAC-3 MSE's fusing system requires a minimum closing velocity threshold at detonation that the near-miss geometry at 22 meters did not quite achieve. The second PAC-3, 3.8 seconds behind the first, had its guidance updated with the post-maneuver trajectory from the fire control radar. It acquired direct kinetic hit at 539.47 at 14 kilometers altitude. The Hwasong 11D's carrier body was destroyed. The DPICM warhead canister, separating from the carrier body at the moment of intercept as the submunition dispenser's timer activated, was structurally intact. It separated from the intercept debris cloud and continued on a ballistic arc for 6.2 seconds before its altitude-activated dispenser fired. At 539.53, at an altitude of 1,100 meters directly above the runway's primary threshold, the DPICM canister dispensed 340 submunitions across the runway surface, the primary taxiway junction, and the eastern edge of the alert ramp. The submunitions rained down across an area 190 meters wide and 380 meters long over 1.4 seconds. On the alert ramp, the 3 Alert 5 F-35s had taxied 60 meters from their parking spots under the engine start sequence. The lead aircraft had reached the taxiway entrance, 140 meters from the edge of the submunition dispersion pattern. Submunitions impacting at the taxiway junction struck the forward section of the lead aircraft's port wing leading edge. 3 M42 equivalents penetrated the composite structure of the leading edge section. One penetrated the port main landing gear bay door and detonated inside, destroying the door actuator assembly and jamming the gear in the down position. The aircraft was not on fire. It was not structurally compromised in any fundamental sense, but it could not retract its landing gear and could not safely exceed 250 knots, effectively grounded for combat operations until the gear actuator was replaced. The second and third F-35As, 40 and 80 meters behind the lead, were outside the primary submunition dispersion footprint. No impacts. Both aircraft continued their taxi sequences. The flight lead, assessing his aircraft as combat ineffective on the radio, ordered numbers 2 and 3 to continue for immediate takeoff and declared his own aircraft non-mission capable. The runway surface between the primary threshold and the 1,200 meter mark, the first 1,200 meters of a 2,743 meter runway, had absorbed approximately 180 submunition impacts. The M42 equivalent creates a crater approximately 8 centimeters in diameter and 4 centimeters deep in asphalt over concrete runway surface. 180 craters across 1,200 meters of runway surface did not prevent aircraft operations. The craters were below the threshold that would cause foreign object debris ingestion in F-35 engines on takeoff roll, but they created a runway surface that required immediate FOD inspection before operations could continue. A 20-minute inspection process that no aircraft scheduled for operations in the next 20 minutes could bypass. F-35. Numbers 2 and 3 taxied to the runway. 15 threshold, the far end of the runway, beyond the submunition impact zone, and executed immediate departures from that threshold at 05, 41, 12, and 05, 41, 19. Both aircraft were airborne. Both were armed and fully mission capable. They reached their combat air patrol stations over the Yellow Sea at 5:58. The Alert 15 aircraft, whose pilots had been running for their jets when the submunitions fell, reached their aircraft to find all 3 in the clean area beyond the dispersion pattern. All 3 were undamaged. Engine start initiated at 5:41:40. First aircraft airborne at 5:43:22. The base's runway inspection team, 6 personnel in armored vehicles equipped with FOD detection equipment, began the threshold inspection at 05:41:30. They completed the primary inspection of the impacted section at 5:57:44 and cleared the full runway for unrestricted operations at 5:58:11. 18 minutes and 18 seconds after the submunition detonation. 18 minutes. During those 18 minutes, 4 additional F-35, as that had been preparing for the morning's first training sortie, were delayed on their ramps. No combat missions were affected. The Alert 5 and Alert 15 aircraft were already airborne, but the 18-minute runway restriction had been a real operational constraint. and in a scenario where ground attack sorties were needed immediately rather than 18 minutes later, it would have been a decisive one. The maintenance assessment of the Alert 5 lead aircraft, conducted in the 90 minutes following the engagement, confirmed the damage profile. Leading edge section replacement required. Landing gear actuator and door assembly replacement required. Full structural inspection of affected composite panels required. Estimated time to return to flight status: 72 hours with priority maintenance resources. One F-35A grounded for 72 hours out of a 6-aircraft alert complement. The DPRK strike, employing 4 missiles at a total assessed production cost of approximately $8 million, had produced 1 aircraft grounding, an 18-minute runway restriction, and the demonstrated capability to penetrate a PAC-3 battery's engagement architecture through a terminal maneuver sequence that separated the DPICM canister from the carrier body at the intercept point. The counter-battery response was already executing before the submunitions had finished falling. At 5:37:11, the moment the Patriot battery commander authorized intercept, the 51st Fighter Wings Command Post transmitted launch coordinates to USFK artillery assets and to the carrier air wing operating in the Yellow Sea, 220 kilometers to the west. 2 FA-18E Super Hornets from the carrier, already airborne on the morning combat air patrol, were diverted at 5:38 to the strike mission while the intercept was still in progress. The 2 TEL vehicles that had fired the 4 Hwasong 11Ds had displaced from their launch positions within 4 minutes of the final launch. A practiced maneuver that was standard DPRK post-launch doctrine and that the US strike planning consistently accounted for and consistently struggled to defeat. The vehicles had moved 3.1 kilometers from their launch coordinates by the time the first data-linked targeting solution was transmitted to the F/A-18ES at 5:41. A US Army M270 multiple launch rocket system battery at Camp Humphreys fired 8 M31A 1 GMLRS unitary rockets at 05:42:19, targeting both original launch coordinates and the predicted displacement corridors based on the Valley Road network geometry surrounding the launch site. 3 rockets impacted the original launch coordinates. Empty terrain. 2 rockets impacted the primary displacement road 2.3 kilometers northeast of the launch point. Imagery collected by a Global Hawk surveillance drone at 5:48 showed 1 TEL vehicle on that road, stationary, with visible damage to its rear axle assembly from a near-miss impact at approximately 30 meters. The vehicle was not destroyed. It was immobilized. The second TEL vehicle had taken the alternative displacement route, north rather than northeast, and was not in the GMLRS impact corridor. The F/A-18Es, now 80 kilometers from the target area and closing, received updated positioning data from the Global Hawk at 5:49:41, showing the second vehicle 4.7 kilometers north of the launch position on a mountain road. GBU 38 JDAM release at 5:52:11 from 34,000 feet. The bomb impacted 6 meters from the TEL vehicle. The vehicle survived the blast, but its erector mechanism was destroyed by fragmentation, rendering it incapable of loading a second missile. Both TEL vehicles were rendered non-operational within 22 minutes of their launches. Neither was destroyed. Both could eventually be repaired, but neither would fire a second missile that morning. The after-action review produced 4 findings that would drive immediate changes to Air Force base defense and aircraft survivability doctrine in the Pacific. The first was the DPICM canister separation gap. The PAC-3 MSE's intercept of the carrier body at 14 kilometers altitude had been technically successful. The carrier was destroyed, but the DPICM canister separation from the carrier body at intercept meant that a technically successful missile intercept could still produce a partial submunition attack. The review directed the immediate evaluation of fusing modifications to the PAC-3 MSE warhead that would ensure complete destruction of the submunition payload at intercept, not merely the carrier vehicle. The second was the aircraft dispersal gap. All 6 alert aircraft had been concentrated on a single ramp within the submunition dispersion pattern of a single warhead impact. The review directed the implementation of maximum aircraft dispersal to hardened aircraft shelters as the standard alert posture for all PACOM airfields within range of DPRK short-range ballistic missiles. Osan's hardened aircraft shelter program, which had been in planning and budget review since 2021, was directed to accelerate its construction timeline from 2029 to 2027. The third was the runway recovery time gap. The 18-minute FOD inspection requirement was assessed as operationally acceptable in the specific context of the March 22nd engagement. The alert aircraft were already airborne. In a scenario where immediate follow-on strikes required rapid sortie generation from the runway, 18 minutes would be unacceptable. Rapid runway repair and FOD clearance equipment pre-positioned at multiple runway threshold points, capable of clearing a 200-meter impacted section in under 4 minutes, was directed for procurement. The fourth was the TEL displacement doctrine gap. The 4-minute post-launch displacement by DPRK TEL vehicles had, for the fourth engagement of this type in the past 3 years of exercises and real incidents, prevented the destruction of the launch vehicles. The review directed a fundamental reassessment of kill chain timing against mobile ballistic missile launchers, specifically the reduction of the time between launch detection and weapons release from the current average of 11 minutes to under 4 minutes by pre-positioning strike aircraft on persistent orbit near the most probable DPRK launch corridors. The political response to the March 22nd strike was managed through the Combined Forces Command, the U.S.-South Korean bilateral command structure that governs all military operations on the peninsula. The ROK government issued an emergency statement at 700 hours, Seoul time, confirming the DPRK attack, confirming that all personnel at Osan were safe, and announcing that the Combined Forces Command had responded with counter-battery fires that had rendered both launch vehicles non-operational. The statement was careful and precise. It did not characterize the engagement as an act of war. It characterized it as a serious provocation that would have significant consequences for the DPRK's security environment. The Kim regime issued no statement for 6 hours. When the statement came, it described the launch as a routine military exercise involving a new type of precision strike system and denied that any U.S. installation had been targeted. The denial was not credible. It was not intended to be credible to Washington or Seoul. It was intended to give Beijing enough diplomatic room to avoid formally condemning an ally's actions in the UN Security Council, which Beijing did by characterizing the situation as one requiring dialogue rather than condemnation. This is what Navy Legends has documented across every scenario in this series. The systematic exploitation of the gaps between what the US military can do and what it has actually built and deployed. The PAC-3 MSE performed. It intercepted 3 of 4 warhead carriers cleanly and achieved a technically successful intercept on the 4th. The DPICM canister separation. Vulnerability it exposed was a known engineering consideration that had not driven a fusing modification. The F-35 on the ramp was damaged not because the PAC-3 failed. It was damaged because the PAC-3 succeeded against the carrier while the payload continued on a ballistic arc to its dispense point, and because 6 alert aircraft were concentrated on a single ramp in a base whose hardened shelter program had been in planning for 5 years without completing construction. 1 damaged aircraft, 18 minutes of runway restriction, a 72-hour repair cycle that consumed priority maintenance resources from a forward deployed unit in a contested theater. These are the numbers that matter to the operational planners who have to sustain combat operations on the second day of a Korean Peninsula conflict, not just the first. The F-35 is the most capable tactical aircraft in the world. It is also 16.9 meters long and 10.7 meters wide, and it sits on an open concrete ramp in the pre-dawn hours at Osan every morning while the sun rises over the Yellow Sea, waiting for the runway alert cycle that begins at first light. What it waits in is a hardened shelter, or an open ramp, is not a question of technology. It is a question of whether the people responsible for building the shelter finished the job before the missile arrived. On March 22nd, they had not. Stay informed. Stay vigilant. I'll see you in the next one.